We're back on the road this April with our live show, Cocaine Cowboys. If you want to hear the story of Ireland's love affair with Colombian powder and those who made millions in the gold rush, limited availability remains in Belfast at ulsterhall.co.uk. That's ulsterhall.co.uk. Firstly, I would think that most of our listeners don't know who the hell Tony Felloni is.
Well, I don't know now if that's true. He is certainly long gone in terms of any influence in the criminal underworld, but he was still one of those major points that, like, one of those major figures that helped set up the drugs trade in this country.
Yeah, but I mean, I think he's just... People will not know who he is. I mean, when you think he's 81 years old, years of age, he's died in a pure case of, do whatever you need to do for your health, but genetics really is where it's at, isn't it?
Yeah, well, genetics trumps all. For the people who are doing...
has,
For the people that are juicing and doing yoga, Tony Felloni did the opposite.
Follow Tony Felloni's. No, he got out of prison in 2011, and I remember every headline was, he's only got weeks to live or whatever it was, because he was supposed to be in such bad health, he was going to die. That was
2011, I think he was released from Portlaoise prison.
So that's 12 years ago. 13 years ago.
Yeah.
So he got another 13 years out of it.
Yeah.
Anyway, he's died suddenly in a hospital in Dublin, and no doubt he will be mourned.
But Mel, I think, like, normally we can say when guys die, the criminal figures in the underworld, they will be mourned. And they often are mourned and well loved by a community and by a family and by people that they've known all their lives. In Tony Felloni's case, I'm actually not sure that's fully true. He was a deeply unpopular figure in Dublin because of his introduction into... because of involvement in the heroin trade, which has always been seen as an antisocial thing. But Tony Felloni was also a deeply unpopular person and caused, as much as he caused damage to the city and to the community, he inflicted that damage on his own family. I'm not sure Tony Felloni will be mourned by many, including the people that his own blood relatives. It's
amazing, though, what the passage of time can do. I mean, you look at Larry Dunn and he had a fractured relationship with his own children. But of course, as he got older and as time went by, like, a lot of those relationships were healed. And he was a beloved dad when he died in different circumstances, but not that long ago. And he would have been around the same era as Felloni. And sometimes I think those blood bonds are always there, no matter what's happened. And I mean, Tony Felloni was not a good dad. There's no question about it. He was peddling heroin into communities in the inner city and outside them, but he was also peddling it into his own family. And there was a kind of belief that he reckoned that you kept the business in the family, and he was giving drugs to his kids when they were very young.
Yeah, so I mean, he got them involved. Yeah, he got them dealing for him. He got them carrying drugs, delivering drugs, collecting money, all from their early teenage years. Not only did he have them involved in the trade of the business of drug dealing, but he also, it was reported at the time, did almost encourage them to become drugs users themselves. And the effects of drugs and the heroin business had a terrible effect on his own family. Also as a father, I think he was a father of 8.
There's a lot of them, yes.
But he, as a husband, he was a violent wife beater.
So he was married to a sister of Mannix Flynn.
He was married to a woman called Anne Flynn, who had also been involved in criminality for a long time, but on a very low level. She was sort of a very, I suppose, infamous shoplifter. These are petty crimes, no doubt about it, but she was one of those people that had been involved in shoplifting on a kind of a professional scale. But, in the 1960s, they raised a number of children together, but she did an interview many years ago about her life with him. I mean, I think at one stage just to quote that interview, she said he was vicious with drink and often knocked me about, but then he'd be full of remorse. So the children would have seen Tony Felloni beating his wife up on a regular basis. He was, as well as being a drug dealer, he was a violent criminal and had a particularly predilection to abusing women. In fact, his first sort of foray into the criminal world came with this kind of scheme in the 1960s where Tony Felloni was a good-looking young man. I don't know if you ever saw the pictures of him.
I did. He was a son of Italian immigrants.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think an Italian father and a Irish mother, I think, Irish-born mother.
And he had a kind of an Italian sort of a swarthy look about him, but...
And he, in the 60s, there's pictures of him dressed in these very fancy suits, very well turned out. And he came up with this kind of scam in the early 1960s where he'd sort of meet young women as they came from the country really and landed in Dublin city centre. And he'd chat them up, convince them to go back to his flat, get them eventually to pose for pictures, take these photographs and then proceed to blackmail them. If they didn't pay him up money, he threatened to show these pictures to their parents. I mean, this is
just
like...
put a little bit of social history around that. In the 1960s, there was women coming from rural communities into the city to work in domestic service. I suppose that wouldn't necessarily happen nowadays, but they were kind of fairly innocent.
Yeah.
And they were coming, teenagers probably just even, hadn't even reached their 20s, and they were coming to Dublin, which seemed to be this huge big city, unfriendly city, and they would have to try and find their accommodation, a job, and then they'd settle down and they'd write letters home. I mean, it's so many miles away from what happens today. It was a quaintness to the life of it, but it left them kind of in their innocence a little bit vulnerable to the likes of Felloni and no doubt others who preyed on them. But he would sort of, seduce them with his good looks and with his charm. They thought that they were,
meeting
they'd met a nice guy and maybe they'd one day bring him home. And instead he was taking their wages off them and blackmailing.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing really if you think about it, because all of this stuff has been in the papers again in the last couple of weeks about people, using the internet to use revenge porn to blackmail women. I mean, it's amazing that Tony Felloni was doing something similar back in the 1960s. And it's again, we know it now and we believe it then as well. Obviously, it's a very, very sinister crime, and you're picking on really people's real vulnerabilities, people who don't deserve to be victims of that type of crime. As he went along, he also became involved in the prostitution trade, which again was a very, very different thing. Some of these women that he met, he seems to have forced them into prostitution in one sense, and it was always said that that business in particular in that time was backed up by a lot of violence. He was effectively a pimp, and probably his first major conviction was for procuring young women for immoral purposes, a charge that is...
When was that?
That was in 1964. So that's obviously to do with prostitution. It's a charge that's long gone and has changed through the statute books over the years. But it's effectively, pimping people out. So all of that was backed with this kind of sinister, violent temperament. As the criminal underworld kept changing, Tony Felloni became heavily involved in burglaries, to a degree involved in armed raids. And that's of its time as well throughout the 70s. He had a number of convictions through that time, relatively minor at that stage. He served a period of time in prison and then left for the UK. Disappeared off the radar for a while around 1980, but when he got over to England, that was his first introduction to the heroin trade, which didn't really exist in Dublin at that stage.
I was going to say, so he was arrested in Surrey in 1981 and he was jailed for 4 years for conspiracy to import heroin. Like that, they are the earliest journeymen into the heroin trade, because it's really only in the late 70s, I think, very late 70s, that heroin sort of becomes available in Europe.
And at that stage, heroin and the heroin users, the typical sort of background of the heroin users in the late 70s is really college student and bohemian types. I mean, it wasn't a sort of an inner city drug, but it did rapidly become so during the 80s. And people like Tony Felloni were at the forefront of turning it in from really a bohemian pastime, and that no doubt caused great destruction even then, but to turn it into what became an epidemic, not just in Ireland, but also across England and Scotland and cities like Liverpool in particular.
And I think it wasn't at all to do with what was happening in Iran. That
it was, and that made
a lot of wealthy people had to flee. They couldn't take their money with them, so they took heroin and, turned it into cash when they got to Europe. And I mean, that because of the flood of the heroin, that's when it started going into the sort of the poorer communities rather than that sort of old. It probably would have even been called opium before that, would it?
Well, opium is different than heroin, even though they're both comes from the same thing. Yeah, but it would have been it was
obviously way back. There was opium dens.
Yeah, and I mean, even in the 19
houses and
and even in the 19. There was always a heroin trade to a degree in Europe, and even if you go back to the 1930s with Lucky Luciano and these guys in America in the mafia, there was a heroin trade and they were done for heroin. But it was the explosion of it into the inner city that came with this mass availability of heroin into Europe. And if you remember back then, like the police forces really weren't prepared for it. They just didn't consider it to be a priority. I mean, I think we're looking back at those days in the 80s, wasn't there? I can't remember the exact statistic. There was 2 people on the drugs unit in the Gardaí or something. It was just really wasn't something that they were prepared for. In Ireland, all of the Garda resources were going into policing the troubles in the north and the spillover down here.
That story is well told in Dublin Narcos by Michael O'Sullivan, who went on to become the chief in the MAOC in the Marine.
Yeah.
Oh God, MAO. Anyway, the Lisbon-based sort of European maritime police force, but he was in that first drug squad essentially, when along with Noreen O'Sullivan, the ex-commissioner, and he went in sort of undercover into some of the ecstasy parties, etc., to try and buy drugs. But Felloni was one of the first guys that they targeted.
Yeah.
And there was something about. He told an interesting story about finding money or drugs in a brick in the wall that he used to kind of go into his house and hide the stuff outside so he couldn't be caught with it. But they did target him. And he wasn't very long operating. Like, he was only back in the Republic in 1984 and he was jailed. He got a 10-year sentence in 1986. So within 2 years, he had sort of flooded the place with heroin, flooded his own family with the drug as well, and, found himself before the courts.
Yeah, he was before the courts very quickly, but he was back in Dublin at the height of that first wave of heroin, the heroin business. And even then he was making big money. You can look back at it now and it feels almost like a very amateurish operations to a degree. There wasn't the sophistication that we see now, where people are not willing to handle stuff, not willing to have stuff around them. Major drug dealers may never even be in the room with a drug shipment or even an amount of money. But it wasn't like that then. But Tony Felloni was still an organised dealer. He had a lot of his children working for him, but he also had other associates as well. And they were really focused on providing heroin within flat complexes around the inner city. I mean, that's where the business was. He was caught quickly. He was given a 10-year sentence, but he was out, I think, within 6 or 7 years. And when he came out again, at that point, the Dunn operation, which had been the primary heroin operation at the time, was gone. Tony Felloni certainly had those contacts in the UK in order to get the heroin in, which is at that point nearly all the heroin was coming from UK sources. A lot of it was coming over on the ferries in kind of mule smuggling, as it might be called now. It wasn't being brought in on containers, or we've had heroin being brought in on planes into Ireland. Most of it was sending addicts across the way to meet somebody, buy it and bring it back in relatively small amounts. So Tony Felloni, as soon as he came out of prison, he was straight back into the drugs trade, and at that point he probably became certainly one of the major suppliers within the inner city. And at that point as well, of course, what had happened to him personally, while he'd started off in the heroin business without being an addict, he'd progressed, or maybe progressed is the wrong word, but he'd become a very chronic heroin addict at that point himself. And he seems to have been way more chaotic the second time in the early 90s. There
was actually a second wave of heroin as well in the early 90s, because it's at that point it was 96 when he's jailed again for a second time, this time for 20 years. I think I was in court that day, but I think he was caught with a huge amount of it. But anyway, I don't have the detail to hand, but there was a second wave in the 90s, because it was around that time, sort of 92 to around 96, where you had Tony Gregory standing up in the Dáil, and he was naming George Mitchell, Thomas Mullen, the boxer, Derek Maradona Dunn, and obviously the Dunn family, sort of certainly Larry Dunn, etc., were well known as heroin dealers. So they were all sort of being, accused of this second wave that came in. And that first wave in the 80s killed people off because they were injecting it. In the 90s, the second wave that came in, the generation who had watched sort of parents and older people die from injecting it, and the HIV and AIDS followed, along with hepatitis. They believed that they could take heroin, but they'd be okay if they smoked it.
Yeah.
And that was what that second wave was involved in. So that sort of was the second big wave of money, really, for Felloni. So he was jailed in 96, as was his son Luigi, who was jailed in 96 in June for heroin dealing. And his daughter, Regina Felloni, was also jailed for 6 years and 9 months for heroin dealing. And she would have been in to Mountjoy Women's Prison, which had just opened as the Doka Centre. And I do recall she sort of got healthy in prison.
Yeah.
She came off the drugs and she sort of got better, really. That was a really significant thing when the Doka Centre was opened, because it was very treated women very well. Their children were allowed to come in to see them in an environment that didn't feel like prison. I think she might have been pregnant in prison, Regina Felloni, and the women were allowed to keep their babies for the first 12 months with them.
Yeah.
They had their own room, and if there was rehabilitation going to happen, it happened within that environment, whereas it hadn't before. While the Fellonis were in jail, the Criminal Assets Bureau came in and trawled around their bank accounts and assets, and they found a good bit for that time, about €300,000.
Yeah, I think it was 400,000 in total, including properties. So, I mean, you're looking back at those days and you can see the money is just literally being spent on people buying houses and lodging big sums in their own bank accounts. It was just a totally different world than what we see now. So he became he was, I think, the first target of the Criminal Assets Bureau, and he resisted it tooth and nail while he was in prison. I think it was 14 years before it was finally and utterly completed. It didn't just look at his own personal assets, but some assets of some members of his family. And but he in that time, he was put in Portlaoise in amongst the highest security prisoners of the time, including people like John Gilligan. You would have had Marlow Highland in that sort of section of Portlaoise prison, Desi O'Hare, really, really serious criminals. But by the time Tony Felloni was jailed, he was, by all accounts, his time in prison wasn't particularly comfortable. He was shown very little respect. He was significantly down the food chain. He had bad health. He'd contracted HIV himself as a result of his drug use, and really was pushed around in prison by all accounts. Kind of attached himself to John Gilligan, who seemed to sort of, bully him around a bit, if you want to call it that. And he was a deeply unpopular person, I think, in the public eye. You're right, he probably is forgotten about. But if you remember back in 1996 when he was convicted, he really was.
He was huge. I mean, it was a huge story at the time, and the 20 years was massive. And
one of the reasons it was massive was because he kept getting caught in the run up to that. When he run up to his conviction, what happened was, I think he got caught 3 times, and he was given bail on each occasion. And he obviously felt like you might as well be, done for a penny as a pound, or a pound as a penny, or whatever it is, in that, like, he knew he was going to prison anyway. He had those previous convictions for heroin. He wasn't going to get off scot-free. So even when he was out on bail, he just kept going and he kept getting caught. And it caused a huge scandal at the time. It moved from like a criminal justice story to being a political scandal. Because he was allowed out on bail, despite obviously breaking his bail conditions, which are that you don't become involved in crime. And that led to legislative changes to the bail laws to allow people to object to bail, and a few other technical things, because it became a kind of a sense of this revolving door where it didn't really matter if once you're going to be done for something, you might as well just keep clocking up the convictions, which we still see to this day with lesser offences. People, public order or whatever, people just rack them up. I'm going to be done, and it's all going to run concurrently. But he got 20 years, which is a huge sentence, really, if you consider it. And there was...
I think it was the lengthiest sentence at the time. You had a few people that got really long sentences. Damon Kelly.
Yeah, and John Gilligan as well got a very, very lengthy sentence.
Yeah.
Dutchy Holland.
A couple of those big, 20, 30-year sentences. And on appeal, some of them were... were lessened. He appealed, and his the final appeal of his sentence. Now, I don't know whether that was for the conviction or for the length of the sentence, but it was dismissed in 99. But at that point, it was all in those probation reports that it came out about the probation and the psychiatric reports that were required for those appeals, that it came out that he was HIV positive. It said that he was totally institutionalized in prison, and that he had obtained drugs. He had a very heavy drug addiction, but he had obtained the drugs in prison, which obviously he had to pay for by whatever means. And at one point it was said that he was unable to manage on his own for more than 2 days, like he almost was in need of a carer.
Yeah.
And thus, when he re-emerges from prison in 2011, there was this furore around him that he wasn't going to survive, and that he was so ill, he was a dependent drug user, and, how was he going to even survive the first day? And of course, such a high profile prisoner, there was a selection of journalists and photographers waiting outside. I think he was in Mountjoy, and he came out that back door of Mountjoy that day. I was there the day he was released, and he hopped in a taxi, made his way into town, and everybody kind of driving after him. To what end? Maybe just to try and see what he had to say. But he was wily enough to make his way into town, hopped out of the taxi at the Halfpenny Bridge, and he ran over the Halfpenny Bridge, which was the pedestrian bridge, obviously. Yeah. So unless you could abandon your car, that was him gone. So it was quite a clever move, and he just disappeared into Temple Bar, and it was like, here he was back in his city. What was he going to do? And he was living kind of in social housing, I think, somewhere in the north or south inner city then. Yeah. And little was heard of him since.
Little was heard of him. Every now and again he was photographed. He did, from time to time, appear in the courts. He did retain a close relationship to a number of his children, certainly after his release. Not all of them. I mean, some of his kids not to get into them specifically, but certainly did get clean and went on to live good lives. So he was pictured here and there. He actually used to be pictured sometimes just appearing in court,
right,
supporting people, or things like that, rather than for himself. He certainly never became involved in criminality. His days were long gone by the time he got out, and he presumably lived a very humble life before dying of a heart attack of natural causes. It's a sorry tale. I think if you look back on it from start to finish, from the 1950s to the mid 2020s, a lot of misery spread, a lot of damage done. And not
lived till his 80s.
He still lived to his 80s.
It is just incredible, that element of it, though, isn't it? Like, you know what I mean?
It is, you can do your yoga and juicing as much as you want.
All you want. And he's been on the launch pad since he was like, I mean, honest to God, I have never seen more headlines that he was on the launch pad to heaven or hell, wherever he's going. But he manages to make it to 81, which is a ripe old age.
King Scum, of course, was his nickname.
And there was a great book written by Paul Reynolds called that.
It was, yeah.
I must dig it out, have it somewhere at home.
I read it myself. It was really good. It was a really good history, obviously of Tony Felloni, but it's actually really interesting, the bits in, and I can't remember all the details now. You read just how amateurish the drug dealing was at that stage, in terms of, like, as you said, their big concession to getting out of it would be, hide it just outside the door. I think there was some in a letterbox, and that was the security measures they take. But despite all that, there was huge money to be made, and it was their business was really solely in those different inner city flat complexes, and they changed the character of Dublin inner city. Tony Felloni and people like that. I mean, they effectively participated in a generation being wiped out, and in some ways, people will still say that the inner city communities never recovered from the heroin epidemic. Felloni and his people like him, made their money, but they made it on the back of a generation being wiped out, and you had kids being raised by grandparents. Look, terrible. It's not, no one man is responsible for what happened, but Tony Felloni really didn't seem to care.
He certainly made his mark. Okay, Niall, thank you very much.
Thanks.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.